So I really liked that image that Vidya Devi finished her talk on, of the monk with his backpack, bringing scriptures from India to China, and with his tiger alongside him. And there were many of those journeys that took place along the Silk Road from India to China. And one of those journeys must have taken place sometime before the year 255. Because in the year 255, that was when the first translation of the White Lotus Sutra happened into Chinese. So sometime before that, someone carried a Sanskrit manuscript, probably one of those things with boards on each side of it, carried that from India on their back to China. And it was translated. It was translated, I think, at least 6 times into Chinese. And the one that we're all familiar with, not the Chinese translation, but the English translations, are mainly from a translation by Kumarajiva, which happened in 406. Okay, so that's Vidya Devi's image of the man with the backpack and the tiger. I want to start with a different image from Philip Pullman's trilogy, his Dark Materials, which some of you will know. It was made into a movie and a BBC series and all that. And the second book in that trilogy is called The Subtle Knife. The subtle knife is a knife that can cut through the fabric of space into opening a doorway into a parallel world, into another world. And the White Lotus Sutra is a bit like that. The White Lotus Sutra is a kind of subtle knife that opens a doorway into another world. Or we could say that the White Lotus Sutra activates our imagination. And our imagination is a subtle knife that opens the doorway into another world. But actually, the White Lotus Sutra doesn't open a doorway into a parallel world. It opens a doorway into a higher world, into a higher dimension. So we could say that what opens a doorway into a higher world or a higher dimension is insight, insight into the nature of reality. So it's insight, which is the subtle knife that opens the doorway into another world. And Bhante used the subtle knife of his intellect, his imagination, and his insight in order to help us to even see the doorway into another world. So I'm going to talk about Bhante's commentaries on the White Lotus Sutra and his approach to what's a very strange text, actually. The White Lotus Sutra is a very strange text. And I might say a little bit about the White Lotus Sutra itself and about its history and its themes, if I have time. And primarily what I'm going to do is going to look at some passages from the White Lotus Sutra and try to apply Bhante's approach to them. So some passages that Bhante hasn't actually opened up for us. So Bhante has commented on the White Lotus Sutra in 3 different places. Firstly, in the Eternal Legacy. There's a whole chapter of the Eternal Legacy on the White Lotus Sutra. I think it's the only text that gets a whole chapter to itself. And again, in a series of 8 talks he gave in 1970, a series of talks on the White Lotus Sutra, the drama of cosmic enlightenment. And again, in a question and answer session based on those talks, which happened, I think, in 1983. And those talks and that question and answer session are what later were put together, probably by Vidya Devi and others, in the Spoken Word project, and brought out as a book called The Drama of Cosmic Enlightenment. And that now appears in volume 16 of the Complete Works, and the Eternal Legacy is in volume 14. And by the way, the notes to the Complete Works are so much better than the notes to the previous volumes. They're really, really helpful for study. They've been expanded and improved, and they're, yes, a very good aid to study. So in that series of talks that Bhante gave in 1970, which is quite early on, you have to imagine 1970, how many order members there were in 1970? I have no idea. Won't have been many. A lot less than there are people in this room, probably about 30 or something like that. And in that series of talks, most of you will have done something with that series of talks in Mitra study, or maybe you've led study on it. You'll remember that Bhante explores some of the parables, the parable of the burning house, the parable of the return journey, the parable of the jewel in the garment, the parable of the good physician, the simile of the rain cloud. He covers all of these things in that series of talks. And I'm not going to talk about any of these today. If you feel encouraged to go back to them, though, I would particularly recommend the parable of the return journey, which Bhante explores in a quite unique way, I think. I haven't come across anybody else who explores it in the way that Bhante does. So what I would like, if possible, is to whet your appetite for going back and diving deeper into Bhante's work, especially into his commentaries, into his seminars, because there are many, many hidden treasures. So what is Bhante's approach to the White Lotus Sutra? Well, in the Eternal Legacy, he simply goes through chapter by chapter, saying what each chapter of the sutra is about. And he makes a few comments at the end. So part of Bhante's method of studying a text is to begin simply by taking the text at its own estimation, understanding what it's saying before trying to interpret it. But the comments he makes at the end of that chapter of the Eternal Legacy are, as we would expect, insightful. So in the Eternal Legacy, he accepts what the translator Suthil says about the sutra. So what Suthil said was, from the first chapter, we find the Lotus Sutra to be unique in the world of religious literature. It presents a spiritual drama of the highest order, with the universe as its stage, eternity as its period, and Buddhas, gods, men, devils as the dramatis personae. So that's what Suthil said. And Bhante adds to this. He says, obviously, such a drama as this is not naturalistic, but symbolic. So Bhante emphasizes the symbolic nature of the events and the statements in the sutra. He refers to some of the seemingly miraculous events as concrete symbols of spiritual truths. And he also notes that even the words Sadharma Pundarika, the white lotus of the true Dharma, Sadharma Pundarika, are symbolic when they appear in the sutra. He says certain more glowingly eulogistic passages of the text would seem to suggest that the words Sadharma Pundarika connote much more than just the title of a sutra, however great, being in truth the appellation of a figured flame that not only blends, but as a unity transcends the three jewels. and is itself the supreme object of devotion and transcendental knowledge, the mysterious, all-comprehending ultimate reality. So, in other words, the white lotus of the true Dharma that is so frequently referred to within the text is not in the same realm as the book you hold in your hand when you're reading it. There are two, you could say there are two different white Saddharma Pundarikas. There's the one you're holding in your hand and reading, and there's the one that's in the realm of the sutra. The White Lotus Sutra that's referred to within the text is an archetypal, it's in a symbolic realm, and therefore not to be taken literally as referring to this particular scripture. In fact, literalism is to be completely avoided and abandoned when we enter into the world of the White Lotus Sutra. So in both the Eternal Legacy and the Drama of Cosmic Enlightenment, Bhante is keen to point out that the Dharma can be expressed conceptually in the language of intellect, in the language of rational thought, but it can and indeed must also be expressed in images, symbols, archetypes, which constitute the language of the imagination and the emotions. He says the White Lotus Sutra explores the Dharma through parables, myths, and symbols. In other words, through archetypes. And then elsewhere he says the language of images is the language of the imagination, the language of the emotions. The White Lotus Sutra appeals not to the head, but to the heart, not to the intellect, but to the imagination. So Bhante uses this term archetype very frequently and deliberately never defines it. Broadly speaking, it seems to refer to something of universal significance, which is communicated directly to the imagination via stories, myths, images, and symbols, all of which have a direct emotional impact before the rational faculty begins its conceptualizing process. So he suggests that the reason why the Mahayana so often resorts to the language of imagination and emotion is because, and I quote, the Bodhisattva represents the ideal in all its perfection and purity beyond space and time, whereas the Arahat represents the realization of the ideal within the conditions and limitations of space and time. So this view of the two modes of communication is an important aspect of Bhante's understanding and approach to not just the White Lotus Sutra, but to lots and lots of different texts, whether Mahayana or Pali Canon. And this understanding of the necessity of imagination and emotion, if one is to truly have a vision of reality, is why an engagement with the arts, for instance, is one of the distinctive emphases of Triratna. So when Bhante gave that series of lectures in 1970, he was very keen to make clear that the sutra should not be approached with rational thought, at least not at first. It is a drama, and it's to be experienced as a drama. And as Sutil said, a spiritual drama of the highest order with the universe as its stage, eternity as its period, and Buddhas, gods, men, devils as the dramatis personae. And Bhante goes a bit further than this. The sutra is not only a cosmic drama with the universe as its stage, but he says we can say the whole drama of cosmic enlightenment takes place not only without, on the stage of the cosmos, but also within, in the recesses of our own heart. So this is very important when we come to engage directly with the sutra. It can be seen as a drama that is taking place both externally and internally. The sutra can be approached, can be interpreted and experienced in these two ways. And when he was asked directly in that seminar in 1983, he was asked directly how we should approach study of a text like this. So here's a text that he says it's not meant to be rationalized and so on. How to approach a study of a text like this. And he says the main thing is to avoid literalism. You should familiarize yourself with the letter of the text, but not take it too literally. I would almost advise that you should not take it too seriously. Read it in the way that you would read good poetry or a good novel. Enjoy it, immerse yourself in it. To begin with, it is very important to allow the work as a whole to have some impact on you, to try to experience it as a whole rather than getting lost in the details. And then in his talk later on the magic of a Mahayana Sutra, which I think is one of the Vimalakirti Nidesha series of talks, he says, what I'm getting at is that sutras can be approached as sources of inspiration and enjoyment, not as texts that you have to slog your way through because you happen to be a Buddhist. And this is what Mahayana Sutras are all about, to take us away from the ordinary, to give us a taste of the magical. So, to borrow a phrase from Subhuti, we want to avoid cloaking the sutra or the sutras in a veil of shallow sacredness. We can read them as if they were novels, maybe avant-garde novels. And of course, we can also regard them as pujas or even as sadhanas, particularly texts like the White Lotus Sutra, when it comes to engaging with them more fully. So in the talk entitled The Drama of Cosmic Enlightenment, which is the second chapter of the book of that name, he says, you probably won't make sense of it, and I'm afraid I'm not going to offer much help. Don't try to work it all out. Don't ask yourself what it all means. This is something transcendentally surrealistic, and you really haven't a hope of working it all out. Now, I think he's being too modest when he says he's not going to offer much help. In fact, his talks offer a great deal of help, and they make the sutra much more accessible than it would otherwise be. And when he says you really haven't a hope of working it all out, I think that although that may have been true of his audience in 1970, it's not necessarily completely true of this audience here now. Many of you, have been studying and are practicing the Dharma for years, decades even. So we may not be able to work it out in the sense that of transforming all the images and archetypes into lucid concepts, but I think we are, or we may be, capable of intuitive leaps of understanding and vision, and also capable of avoiding literalism. So the White Lotus Sutra is a compilation of texts, and it gradually came together over a period of 200 years at least, maybe even longer than that. Most of the scholars agree that chapters 2 to 9 came first, and the verse sections came before the prose. In the book, you'll find the prose comes before the verse, but in history, the verse came before the prose. And the verse sections are quite likely to have been part of an oral tradition. So those first chapters, 2 to 9, were written down sometime in the 1st century BCE. So they're pretty old. And chapter 1 and chapters 10 to 22 came probably sometime maybe 50 to 70 years later in the first century of the Common Era. And then chapters 23 to 28 and chapter 12, gradually over a period of many, many years, maybe 100 years. The scholars, by the way, don't always agree on the details. If you're interested in the history of the White Lotus Sutra, which there is one book, which is this one by Donald Lopez, who's an American scholar specializing in the White Lotus Sutra, and it's called The Lotus Sutra, A Biography. It's a very good read, actually, if you're at all interested in the history of the Lotus Sutra. But what I want to do now is to take a look at the first chapter of the sutra and see whether we can apply Bhante's approach to it. As you listen to the sutra, I'm going to read out a few pages for you. As you listen to the sutra, bear in mind that the Lotus Sutra is a cosmic drama. It all happens on a higher level. And that higher level or higher realm that the sutra is lifting us up to could be called an archetypal realm or a symbolic realm or a realm of the illumined imagination. Bhante tells us it's a realm of undefined truths. He also tells us we can experience the archetypal realm only because we ourselves are, on another level, archetypal beings. If we really allow ourselves to become absorbed in a Mahayana sutra, we become part of it. This means that the sutra is not only a cosmic drama, it is also an inner drama. What we engage with imaginatively has a reciprocal effect on us. So I'm going to read the beginning of the first chapter of the sutra, and I've abridged it quite a bit. I've taken out all the names. Yeah, it lists lots of names. It gives all the names of bodhisattvas and nagas and kimnaras and so on. So I've taken out all the names. But you just need to listen and notice your responses. Bhante says elsewhere, he says, symbols do not have any one meaning. It's not so much a question of understanding a symbol as of allowing yourself to be influenced by it. A bit like a painting, a bit like the man with the tiger. It's not a matter of understanding, but allowing yourself to be influenced by it. So, here it is. This is what I heard. At one time, the Buddha was in Rajagriha, staying on the Vulture's Peak. Accompanying him were a multitude of leading monks, numbering 12,000. All were arahats, having no more defilements and delusions. They had attained what was to their advantage and had put an end to the bonds of existence, and their minds had achieved a state of freedom. All were great arahats who are well known to others. There were also 2,000 people, some of whom were still learning and some who had completed their learning. There was the nun, Mahaprajapati, with her 6,000 followers. And there was Rahula's mother, the nun, Yashodhara, with her followers. There were Bodhisattva Mahasattvas, 80,000 of them, none of them ever regressing in their search for supreme perfect enlightenment. All had gained dharanis, delighted in preaching, were eloquent, and turned the wheel of the law that knows no regression. They had trained themselves in compassion, were good at entering the Buddha wisdom, and had fully penetrated the great wisdom and reached the further shore. Bodhisattvas, Mahasattvas such as these, numbering 80,000, were in attendance. At that time, the heavenly king Shakra, with his followers, 20,000 Devaputras also attended. There were 8 Naga kings, each with several hundreds of thousands of followers. There were 4 Kimnara kings, each with several hundreds of thousands of followers. There were 4 Gandharva kings, each with several hundreds of thousands of followers. There were 4 Ashura kings, each with several hundreds of thousands of followers. There were 4 Garuda kings, each with several hundreds of thousands of followers. And there was King Ajatashatru, the son of Vaidehi, with several hundreds of thousands of followers. Each of these, after bowing in obeisance before the Buddha's feet, withdrew and took a seat to one side. At that time, the world-honored one, surrounded by the 4 kinds of believers, received offerings and tokens of respect and was honored and praised. And for the sake of the Bodhisattvas, he preached the great vehicle sutra entitled Immeasurable Meanings, a teaching to instruct the Bodhisattvas. When the Buddha had finished preaching this sutra, he sat with his legs crossed in the lotus position and entered into the samadhi of the origin of immeasurable meanings, his body and mind never moving. At that time, heaven rained down Mandarava flowers, great Mandarava flowers, Manjushaka flowers, and great Manjushaka flowers, scattering them over the Buddha and over the great assembly. And everywhere the Buddha world quaked and trembled in 6 different ways. At that time, the monks, nuns, laymen, laywomen, the heavenly beings, Nagas, Yakshas, Gandharvas, Ashuras, Garudas, Kimnaras, Maharagas, the human and non-human beings in the assembly, and the petty kings and wheel-turning sage kings, all these in the great assembly, having gained what they had never had before, were filled with joy, and pressing their palms together, gazed at the Buddha with a single mind. At that time, the Buddha emitted a ray of light from the tuft of white hair between his eyebrows, one of his characteristic features. The ray of light lighting up 18,000 worlds in the eastern direction. There was no place that the light did not penetrate, reaching downward as far as the Avicii hells and upward to the Akanishta heavens. From this world, one could see the living beings in the 6 paths of existence in all of those other lands. One could likewise see the Buddhas present at that time in those other lands and could hear the sutra teachings that those Buddhas were expounding. Okay, I'll leave it there. So Bhante begins his commentary. He does have a little commentary on this bit, just a little bit. He begins his commentary by looking at the phrase, "Thus have I heard," which is the title of our weekend, which was suggested by me to Dhammarati, so he's picked. And Bhante gives the traditional explanation. Ananda is speaking, is beginning by saying that he has heard this from the Buddha. And then Bhante immediately moves to a very different interpretation of this phrase. He says these words also suggest something more esoteric. In reality, the Buddha is not outside us. The Buddha nature is not outside us, but within us. And we could say that there's not just an Ananda outside in the realm of history, there's also an Ananda inside us. So the Ananda inside of us hears the voice of truth within. Ananda, we could say, is our own ordinary mind listening to the utterance of our own enlightened consciousness. It's as if we have two consciousnesses, a lower one and a higher one. The lower consciousness usually ignores the higher one and goes its own way, or maybe doesn't even know that the higher one exists. But if that lower consciousness just stops and listens for a while, if it is receptive, it becomes aware of the voice of the higher consciousness. So like Ananda, listening to the voice of the Buddha, our ordinary mind can be receptive to the higher mind, the enlightened mind within us. And it was this idea of an Ananda within and a Buddha within that led Bhante to saying that the whole drama of cosmic enlightenment could be seen as happening in the recesses of our own heart. And later he uses this idea in his interpretation of the parable of the return journey. But of course, we need to be careful not to take Bhante literally as well. Knowing his caution with the Tathagata doctrine, we can be sure that his imaginative way of suggesting that there is something in us, in human consciousness, that thirsts for meaning and responds to what is highest. That's what he's talking about, really, that there's something in human consciousness that really thirsts for meaning. So I'm not going to go over what else Bhante says about this part of the sutra, because actually he says very little as it happens. But I want to try and apply his approach to unfolding some meaning that may be relevant to us. So in this opening chapter of the sutra, the Buddha is deep in meditation and everyone is being shown a vision. The light from his forehead goes out and it makes a vision clear to everyone, a vast cosmic vision of the whole of existence, its worst hells and its greatest joys. The 6 realms are mentioned, and of course, beyond that, the transcendental Buddha fields are mentioned. Everybody is having this vision of existence given to them by the Buddha, and they're all joyful and of one mind. And we too, we have been given this vision of the possibilities open to humanity, the possibilities to rise to states of consciousness that transcend all egotism, and the vision of becoming of one mind, being on the same spiritual wavelength, which Bhante refers to elsewhere as the coincidence of wills. So in the text, it says, the Buddha sent forth a ray of light illuminating 18,000 worlds in the eastern quarter, leaving no place unlit. So the east, of course, is where the sun rises, the source of light. And to orientate yourself towards the east is to orient yourself towards the light. The east, sunrise, is a metaphor for the source of the highest wisdom. Those around the Buddha at the beginning of the sutra include monks and nuns, lay men, lay women, some very spiritually advanced individuals and newcomers, and a vast number of non-human beings. These mythological creatures, heavenly kings, nagas, and so on, some are beings of the sky, some are beings of the depths, and the yaksha. The yaksha is a nature spirit, mainly benevolent, sometimes mischievous. All these creatures are mythic and symbolic. And interestingly enough, although they're all present here, all present in the assembly, listening to the Buddha, some of them are enemies. Constant enemies, like the Devas and the Ashuras. They're all there, but they're enemies. The Garudas, who are great eagles, and the Nagas are enemies. So we could see them as representing certain energies or forces at play in the world. or even energies or forces at play in the human psyche, both individually and collectively. All these forces, all these energies need to be eventually orientated in the same direction towards Buddhahood. And that's what's happening here at the beginning of the Lotus Sutra. Just as the Buddha's audience here is of one mind, we individually need to be of one mind, or as we say, integrated. And the more that we as individuals can integrate all the forces and energies of our own mind to move in one direction, the more progress we make. And the spiritual community, of course, consists of like-minded individuals. And when those like-minded individuals are all orientated in the direction of enlightenment as fully as possible and able to cooperate and work together, then the Arya Sangha arises. The spiritual community becomes like an integrated mind. So in these first few pages of the sutra, you may have noticed that what we're introduced to is the three jewels. We're introduced to the three jewels in a way that we may not be accustomed to, a non-conceptual introduction. The Buddha is center stage, sitting on the vulture's peak, which, by the way, according to Bhante, represents the intermediate place between the mundane and the transcendental, the place of transition, just like the lotus and the moon mat in most sadhanas. Then the Dharma is introduced as a vision of all existence, from the lowest realms of the wheel of life to the highest Buddha fields. And the ideal Sangha is introduced with the words, all of this great assembly joyfully placed their palms together and with one mind contemplated the Buddha. So the White Lotus Sutra places the three jewels center stage right from the start. How could it do otherwise? It isn't really possible to give any discourse on the Dharma without reference to the Buddha and the Sangha. The Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha are inseparable. So what happens next in the sutra? Well, everyone is puzzled. And they want to know, what does it mean? Why has the Buddha emitted this light from his forehead, revealing all these worlds? Fair enough question. The Bodhisattva Maitreya, the Bodhisattva of loving kindness, doesn't know what's going on. And he can see that all of the others present are also wondering what it all means. So he turns to Manjushri, the Bodhisattva of wisdom, to explain. In fact, he kind of sets up Manjushri. He says, you should know, Manjushri, that the four groups and the Nagas are watching you intently, wondering what you will say. Imagine that for an introduction to a talk, eh? So Manjushri is not daunted by this. And he proceeds to go into a long explanation by talking about Buddhas who lived in an inconceivably long time ago. He begins with a Buddha called Light of the Sun and Moon, Surya Chandra Pradipa. We have an order member called Surya Chandra Pradipa, who lived in a time that was infinite, innumerable, inconceivable myriads of kalpas ago. A kalpa, by the way, is about 4.5 billion years. But it hardly matters how long it's, because there are infinite, innumerable, inconceivable myriads of them. And it's very typical of Mahayana sutras to introduce numbers like this. And what it's indicating here is that the things being described are not happening within time at all. They're beyond time. But what does that mean? What does it mean that they're beyond time? They're happening in a mythic archetypal realm, not in the realm of ordinary time and space. In the mythic realm, where the Lotus Sutra drama is taking place, there is no time, and the same applies to space. In our ordinary lives, space can seem large or small, depending on comparisons. In the mythic realm, space and time are not just inconceivable, they're irrelevant. And the way Mahayana sutras show this is by conjuring up absurd, outlandish distances or periods of time, and leaving you to realize that there's no way you can conceive of such infinities and such immensities. Only imagination can help. And this way of describing things is also hinting at the nature of mind, the nature of human consciousness. It is also vast and inconceivable. We are not the small, limited creatures we may think we are. We're being encouraged to view ourselves as also mythic, dimensionless beings, not to be measured and weighed and categorized like little parcels of psychological complexes or something like that. And Manjushri goes on in this vein. He goes on saying that the Buddha called Surya Chandra Pradipa, after him, there came a line of 20,000 Buddhas, all of the same name. And eventually he gets to a Buddha who does exactly the same as the Buddha has done at the opening of the sutra, emitting a ray of light, illuminating 18,000 Buddha lands in the eastern quarter. And finally he gets to the answer to Maitreya's question. At that time, in the infinitely distant past, after emitting the ray of light from his forehead, the Buddha preached a sutra called Saddharma Pundarika, the White Lotus Sutra of the True Dharma. So Manjushri adds another little bit. He says, at that time, there was a bodhisattva called Wondrous Light, Dipankara, who after the death of the Buddha, of that Buddha, kept the teaching of the sutra alive by preaching it for the full duration of 80 lesser kalpas. Then he says, the Bodhisattva Wondrous Light had 800 disciples, one of whom, known as Fame Seeker, Yasakama, was greedily attached to gain and offerings. However, apparently Fame Seeker had some merits too. And Manjushri says, you should know, Maitreya, that the Bodhisattva Wondrous Light of that time was not someone unknown to you. Indeed, he was none other than myself. And the Bodhisattva Fame Seeker was none other than you. So I think the compilers of the sutra are having a bit of fun here, what we might call Bodhisattva play. First, Maitreya sets up Manjushri, saying everyone is watching you and they're wondering what you're going to say. And then Manjushri teases him in turn by adding that little bit about at the end of his long explanation. It's also another little bit of encouragement for the rest of us. He's saying something like, look, even Maitreya, the Bodhisattva of compassion, the Bodhisattva of loving kindness, he was once a greedy fame seeker. The White Lotus Sutra, by the way, is full of encouragement all the way through. So the upshot of it all is that when the Buddha emits the ray of light from his forehead, it means that he's about to preach the White Lotus Sutra. But hang on a minute. We're already in the White Lotus Sutra. Why are we being told that the sutra is about to be preached? I'm going to leave that question hanging there. There's a literal answer to it, and there's a more imaginative answer. And I haven't really got time to go into them, but I have mentioned both of them already. So you'll have to go back and listen to this talk if you want to find out. So in this talk, I'm trying to whet your appetite for study in a way, and in particular your appetite for study of Bhante's deep thought and imaginative reflections. And when I say study, I think the word study has connotations for some people which don't need to apply to what I'm talking about here. Some people think of study as something very heady and intellectual and the sort of thing probably they had to do at school in order to pass exams. I'm talking about simply exploring the Dharma, exploring what is most meaningful to us. We can explore that individually and then explore it collectively. And by doing that and by reflecting on it, we go deeper and deeper, and we gain insight. We gain insight because we're looking at, whether we're looking at the scriptures or looking at Bhante, we're looking at an insightful elucidation of the Dharma. So by way of whetting your appetite still further, I'm coming to the end now, in case you're getting tired. By way of whetting your appetites a little bit further, I want to jump now to chapter 25 of the sutra. And the title of this chapter is The Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara as Universal Gateway. So one of Bhante's talks in the series on this sutra is about Avalokiteshvara, but it's not really about Avalokiteshvara as he appears in the Lotus Sutra. So this is something that, another thing that Bhante does sometimes. He takes a text and simply uses it as a takeoff point for what he really wants to talk about. Yeah. But I want to leave you with a curious little incident from this chapter, which you can reflect on and meditate on. So here it is. The Bodhisattva Akshayamati addressed the Buddha saying, "World-honored one, I will now pay homage to the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara." Thereupon he unfastened his necklace of pearls worth 100,000 pieces of gold and presented it to Avalokiteshvara, saying, "Virtuous one, please accept this offering of the Dharma, this precious pearl necklace." But the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara would not accept it. Again, the Bodhisattva Akshayamati said to the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, "Virtuous one, out of kindness for us, please accept this necklace." Then the Buddha said to the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, "Out of kindness for this Bodhisattva Akshayamati and the four groups, as well as the heavenly beings, Nagas, Yakshas, Gandharvas, Ashuras, Garudas, Kimnaras, Maharagas, human and non-human beings, and others, you should accept this necklace." The Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara immediately accepted the necklace, out of kindness for the four groups, etc., etc. He divided it into two parts, offering one part to Shakyamuni Buddha and the other to the stupa of the eternal Buddha, Abundant Treasures. So what are we to make of that? What's going on? Why did Avalokiteshvara refuse the offering? Why did he then accept it? Why did he divide it in two halves? Does this have any relevance for us? What could you offer to Avalokiteshvara? Would he accept your offering? What does it mean to make an offering? What does accepting an offering mean? Akshayamati means inexhaustible mind. And Avalokiteshvara, in this context, is the regarder of the cries of the world. Do these names have any relevance to the meaning of the incident? So if you dive deeply into the White Lotus Sutra, or other Mahayana sutras, or even suttas in the Pali Canon, you will encounter many symbolic incidents of this kind, which only yield insights if you reflect and meditate on them with an open mind and an imaginative mind. You have to enter into the sutra, immerse yourself in it, and then it begins to reveal its many meanings as if by magic. I found myself, when I was studying the Lotus Sutra, often doing this. I would read it, I would think about it, I would become really familiar with it, and then sometimes I would take it into meditation and realize that I hadn't really understood until something arose much more intuitively about what was being said. And that kind of imaginative immersion, that contemplation, meditation, that was Bhante's approach to the White Lotus Sutra and many other sutras. So may we be inspired to follow him, to follow Bhante in these depths and heights, these worlds of parables, myths, and symbols. Over to you.